The very beginning of statistical inference corresponds to a play, a theater play, in 4 acts. You have characters: the father, Carl Pearson; the son, Egon Pearson. You know, most people consider that the Neyman and Pearson theory, it is the Pearson of the correlation, the Pearson correlation coefficient. No, this is the son of the Pearson correlation coefficient. And in fact, the Pearson correlation coefficient was not created by Carl Pearson. But that's life. That's life. So the correlation has been created before Carl Pearson, but history said that it is Carl Pearson. Anyway, Carl Pearson was a very bright man, and he was a mathematician, and he did a postdoc in German literature. And this is interesting because, you know, today it is inconceivable to do a PhD in mathematics and to do a postdoc in German literature. Perhaps we are wrong in a way. Perhaps we are too specialized. You know, this guy had a very broad way to see science and statistics in particular. So there is a son, Egon Pearson. There is a genius, Ronald Fisher, who was really a genius. You know, because he discovered many things in biostatistics, but also he is the guy who decided that randomization is a methodological tool that is very interesting in science. Randomization, you can imagine, the Nobel Prize in Economy this year has been given to people who do randomized control study in economy. 100 years after he created the method. So you have the genius, Ronald Fisher. But Ronald Fisher was not really a mathematician. Of course, knew mathematics, but you have to realize that in 1920, mathematics were not at all like our mathematics today. They were much less formal, much less rigorous. In particular, you know that the theory of probability was created, in particular with Kolmogorov, in 1933. 1933. So after the creation of statistical types of hypotheses. And so Fisher was a genius, but what he did was not so rigorous on a mathematical point of view. On the contrary, Neyman was a mathematician. Coming from Eastern Europe, he did a PhD on Lebesgue theory, and he came back then he came then in Great Britain and later in the United States. And all these guys have met more or less, and I worked together in the University College of London between 20 and 35, and after, because the play we longed for many years, and it is still now today. And the audience of the play, millions of people, perhaps tens of millions of people or more, because many scientists use p-value and type 1 error in their work today. Okay, so there are 4 acts. The first act is the genius, about how Fisher proposed his way to consider, to conceptualize statistical inference. There is first a paper, a major paper, in 1922, a paper of 60 pages, mainly written in English, no formula. And in this paper, you have the notion of likelihood, not a minor notion in statistics, the concept of sufficient statistics, and the concept of goodness of fit test, which is in fact, even at this time for Fisher, a t-test is some kind of goodness of fit test. And what does he say? He says, you need a sufficient statistics, and you need to estimate the probability that a worse fit should be obtained from a random sample of a population. And everything is in these few words. First, you have a population, and this is Fisher who imagined the concept of a hypothetical infinite population behind the samples that you are studying. This is what we teach to students. You have a sample, and this sample comes from a population. This is random sample from a population, while in practice, this is never the case. Very rarely, you have a sample that comes randomly from a population. And Fisher, of course, knew that. He knew that, and he said, no, this is a hypothetical underlying infinite population. And in fact, we observe a sample, and we are going to say things about this underlying population. And this was very shocking for his colleagues, in particular for Karl Pearson, because Karl Pearson said, the sample, you have the sample, it is there. But this hypothetical underlying population, what is it? This is a fantasy. So you are doing science with a fantasy. This is not science. And this is a real question. This is a real question. We will come back to that. So this is really some kind of genius idea to propose that. The second point, 3 years after, he wrote a book, a practical good book about how to do in practice statistical tests as they are presented in his very theoretical paper of 1922. And so in this book, there are tables how to estimate in practice p-values. And of course, these tables, they were created only for some particular value of p. And so he did the tables for p equal to 0.10, 0.5, 0.02, and 0.01. And here is what he says, if p is between 0.1 and 0.9, no reason to suspect the hypothesis tested. If it is below 0.02, strongly indicated that the hypothesis fails to account for the rule. We shall not often be astray if we draw a conventional line at 0.05. And this is when happens the famous 0.05. This is just to say, well, 0.2, 0.9, not enough. 0.02, well, very good. 0.05, why not? It could be the threshold. Cool. So this was the first act. The second act concerned the mathematician. I say Neyman was the mathematician who would say there is Neyman and Pearson, this is Egon Pearson. But it seems that in the Neyman and Pearson paper, Pearson was not the main author of the paper. This is what historians say. At least in the controversy that will happen between Fisher and Neyman, Egon Pearson never wanted to enter in the discussion. So, this is a paper of 1928, so 3 years after the book of Fisher. And Neyman and Pearson say these very important words, without hoping to know whether each separate hypothesis is true or false. This is very important. For Neyman and Pearson, they will never consider that H0 or H1 will be considered as true or false. This is important because today everybody considers the opposite. And this is where begins the misunderstanding. We may search for rules to govern our behavior with regard to them. And so we are looking for rules of behavior. That is, we will have two hypotheses and we want to have a behavior to choose between the hypotheses, not to consider that the hypothesis, which hypothesis is true or false. No, we just have to choose, and we are looking for a way to choose in a rational way. And because we have to choose between two hypotheses, there is a type 1 and the type 2 error that you know, and this is the paper 1928 where there is the sketch of the type 1 and the type 2 error. You know, you have two ways to be wrong, as we know that today. So in this paper, Neyman and Pearson acknowledge that they will use the ratio of the likelihood. Of course, our test mainly remain of likelihood ratio, as you know. But who had the idea of likelihood ratio? It was Fisher. And here they acknowledge that Fisher has therefore introduced the term likelihood and calls this comparative measure the ratio of the likelihood of the two hypotheses. So they acknowledge in this paper that Fisher was at the origin of likelihood ratio test. In the main paper that we are going to see after, that describe the Neyman and Pearson lemma, they will forget the name of Fisher. You know, even 100 years ago, there were tensions between scientists about authorship. And they say in the paper, without claiming that this method is necessarily the best, clearly this method of discriminating between sample, blah, 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 this method, you know, in this paper, you know that Neyman and Pearson tests are the most powerful tests. But at this time, they didn't know that this procedure led to the most powerful test. They say, you know, without claiming that this method is necessarily the best. So they cannot say this is the best, but they have the intuition that this is the best. And very likely, in fact, Fisher had the same intuition. Fisher had no idea about type 2 errors. But Fisher had the idea, the guess, that the procedure that he proposed with the p-value, in fact, was some kind of the most efficient procedure to develop induction in the analysis of data. But as I told you, Fisher was not a mathematician. Fisher was not interested in these things. He was some kind of he was more an engineer that proposed methods to people to do science. He was not embarrassed by complex mathematical concepts. So after you have the paper in 1933, and this is the main paper of Neyman and Pearson. This is where they prove that they have found the most efficient test. So here again, they mention that they are looking for rule of behavior. They will have to choose between two hypotheses, and they acknowledge that there is a risk in accepting one hypothesis when the other is true, and there is also the risk to accept the second hypothesis when the first is true. And very interestingly, they challenge the relative weight of the two risks. You know, there is a type 1 error, there is a type 2 error, but they are not symmetrical. And they say, is it more serious to convict an innocent man or to acquit a guilty? You know, this is on one side the type 1 error, on the other side the type 2 error, and they ask two people, what is the more important? And because there is this asymmetry, they say, well, we are going to fix 1 to 5%, and then we are going to look at for the most efficient test, because these two risks are not symmetrical. Of course, the problem is that they have, because there is a type 2 error, the alternate hypothesis has to be specified. But they remark that in certain problems, there is a common family of best critical region for each zero. You notice two important words, critical regions, and this is in this paper and the paper precedent that they define critical region that we use in our course every day. So you have critical region, but a priori, if you have H0 and H1, if you have a type 1 and a type 2 error, then H1 has to be clearly specified. But as you know, they will show that in many situations you have uniformly most powerful tests that are independent of H1, and this is what they anticipate here. So, to be short here, you have what we know. You have the Neyman and Pearson theorem in the same paper of 1933. You have two hypotheses, theta is equal to theta 0, theta equal theta 1, as I told you, this is a single alternate hypothesis. And you have a rejection region which corresponds to the ratio of the likelihood according to the two hypotheses. But curiously, this formula can be simplified and theta 1 disappear. In some situation, theta 1 disappear. And so this is the reason why you have a uniformly most powerful test. And this is the reason that when we do a t-test today, even if it is in the Neyman and Pearson theory, we do not need to have H1 to do our t-test. And you can see here the z-test. This is exactly what we do. We compare the mean, the average of x to z alpha sigma. Interestingly, as you know, this test is uniformly the most powerful only on one side. If you consider all the value of theta 1, there is no uniformly most powerful test. Okay. Now, how this has been considered in statistical manual? Because this approach proposed by Fisher and then by Neyman and Pearson, and in fact you could consider that what proposed Fisher is some kind of intuition, and after that Neyman and Pearson took this intuition and formalized the intuition of Fisher in an algorithm with type 1 and type 2 error. You could consider that, as we are going to see in a few slides. Definitely, this is not what Fisher considered. Anyway, how our colleague at that time read this paper and translated this paper into statistical manuals. I have taken a very famous statistical manual, which is Statistical Methods by Snedekor. This is a very famous manual, and the first edition has been in 1937. So I have both the first edition, the fifth edition, and the eighth edition to see the change in the way they formulate, they teach statistical tests or hypotheses in the book with the same author across age. So you can see in the first edition, this is very minimalist. By a fairly general concurrence of opinion, so this is just like that, any value of a chi-square as large as 4 is designated significantly great or merely significant. This is what we say. If you have a z larger than 1.96, you say that this is statistically significant. This is just what we say. And so they had an example with Guy's peak, and there was 13 Guy's peak, 30. On 30 there was 18 males, 12 females. And they asked, is it compatible with a 50-50 probability? And they estimate the chi-square and say, no, the p-value is too high. And so one concludes that the sample may well have been drawn for a population with a 50-50 sex ratio. This is just a few lines to explain at that time what are statistical tests, And you are in 1937 after the paper of Neyman and Pearson, and there is no type 1 error, no type 2 error, no H0, no H1. And in a way, what they do corresponds to what Fisher wrote in his book in 1925. Even if there is no mention of this book, there is no mention of Fisher at that point. Let us see the fifth edition, 20 years after. 20 years after, you have the error of the first kind and you have the error of the second kind. So, a rupture. In the first edition, you have Fisher. 20 years after, you have Neyman and Pearson. So you have a null hypothesis and you have an alternative hypothesis. And you see that this alternative hypothesis can be accepted. It is written. As you know, many statisticians say you can only reject hypotheses, you never can accept them. In this book, it is mentioned that you can accept hypotheses. But if you accept hypothesis, this is not to say that the hypothesis is true. Look at what is there. It is understood that a biologist seldom, if ever, rests his decision wholly on a test of hypothesis. Knowing that a sample furnishes evidence but not proof, he adds this evidence to that already accumulated from experience and reports of other research. You know, this is very humble in the way we are supposed to use statistical tests of hypotheses. This is just a way, an indication about what we say. We have to consider many other things. Now the 8th edition. And curiously, the 8th edition of the same book, well, now there is Cochrane also, and this 8th edition is a real mess about the description of what is the test of hypothesis. You have mu0 and mu8, okay, so you have two hypotheses, and here there is a very complicated sentence that says that you cannot, when the statistic is high, you can accept HA, and so you have a certain risk that H0 be true, and on the contrary, if the statistic is low, then you are likely to accept H0, but perhaps HA. But there is not explicitly a type 1 and a type 2 error, while in the 5th edition it was explicitly mentioned. And interestingly, you know, there is a sentence about if you want to be accepted by your peers in the scientific journal, then you have to compare A and B with a test of significance. So now it is considered in 1999 that if you want to publish a paper, then you have to obtain a p-value inferior to 5%. And you know that this is the beginning of the end. However, it is not clear what should conclude from a non-significant result. A test of significance is most easily taught as a rule for deciding whether to accept or reject the null hypothesis. But the meaning of the word accept requires carefully thought. A non-significant result does not prove that the null hypothesis is correct, merely that it is tenable. So, in the 5th edition, you can accept an hypothesis. In the 8th edition, it is suggested that you should not accept an hypothesis. And these are the same authors. So you can see how the same authors, with time, they are not obviously at ease to understand how they should present what is a statistical test of hypothesis. And in this edition appears the one-sided and two-sided business of statistical tests. In the previous edition, there was no one-sided and two-sided test. And suddenly appears one-sided and two-sided test, and I don't know why. They say, well, the investigator notes only deviation from the null hypothesis in one direction and ignores deviation in the other direction. Sometimes the investigator knows enough about the circumstance to be certain that if mu is not equal to mu0, then mu is greater than mu0. Okay, this is sometimes what we say to students, but definitely this is not in the Neyman and Pearson lemma. Definitely not. So why this happened at that time? We will discuss about that too. So now, Act 4, the quarrel, the dispute, the fight between Fisher and Neyman and Pearson. So Fisher was very angry about how, this is my interpretation. My interpretation is that Fisher considers that he has discovered statistical tests of hypothesis. But because he was not a famous mathematician, Neyman and Pearson conceptualized and formalized his intuition, and what happens today is that in manuals, everybody presents the theory of Neyman and Pearson. And for him, this is not fair because he was at the origin of statistical tests. And so he is angry. He is angry, and there are two papers important in 1955 and 1956. So a man who rejects, put quotes, of hypothesis provisioning as a matter of habitual practice when the significance is 1% or higher, will certainly be mistaken in not more than 1% of the decision. So you have now, here you have a p-value, and here you have a type 1 error. However, this calculation is absurdly academic. Clearly, Fisher does not care about type 1 and type 2 error. This is not his problem. This is not a problem. And he said, well, what about this error of the second kind? This error of the second kind depends greatly on how closely the alternate hypothesis resembles the null hypothesis, and he is completely true. He is completely true, because at that time what happens? You have on the theory H0 and H1, but H1 is a unique alternate hypothesis. But in the textbook you have no more that. You have H0 and H1, which is PA different from PB. And so there is no more really type 2 error, because the type 2 error depends explicitly on what is the alternate hypothesis. And of course, Fisher says that, and here he is right. And after, about the type 2 error, that is the risk to accept the null hypothesis, he said it is a fallacy to conclude from a test of significance that the null hypothesis is thereby established. At most, it may be said to be confirmed or strengthened. And here is the beginning of the confusion that exists in textbook. Because if you look at Neyman and Pearson theorem, you have H0, H1, type 1 error, type 2 error. You have to accept, you have the test, the objective of the test is a behavior, as Neyman said. It is a behavior that you will choose. You have to choose between two hypotheses. And so at the end, you accept one hypothesis. And if you accept it, you have a risk to accept that, but you accept the hypothesis. But Fisher disagrees completely with that. He considers that a scientist does not accept a hypothesis. A scientist sees the results, and if the p is small, then this is very likely that I have found something. If the p is very high, unfortunately, I didn't succeed to find something. But there are many potential reasons for that. Statistical power, but perhaps also measurement error. Perhaps also I was wrong in my experiments. And so I cannot say anything. If I accept H0, I cannot say anything. There is no way to accept H0. And because you have both, when you have to write a statistical manual, it becomes really difficult. He's a little bit naughty with Neyman. He said, for Neyman, reasoning means deductive reasoning. And why he says that? Because Neyman is a mathematician, and for mathematicians there are deduction. That's all. And so because Neyman is a mathematician, for him reasoning means that deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning, for he does not clearly understand what it is. And I am afraid he is right. I am afraid he is right. For Fisher, statistical reasoning is an induction. And because Neyman was a very high-level mathematician, very involved in mathematics, Neyman saw mainly deduction. And Neyman is not at ease with induction, and we will come back also on that. So he said that he proposed test of significance, and there is nothing to say that this is an acceptance procedure. Fisher, as I told you, Fisher considers that his p-value is to determine the level of plausibility of of the hypothesis that the scientists want to present to the community. But there is no way to accept something or not. This is just a way to say that there is noise, but this noise is not enough to consider that what I propose to you is something fake. No, there exists something really behind the noise. This is exactly what he says, that when decision is needed, the business of inductive difference to evaluate the nature and extent of uncertainty with which the decision is encumbered. That is, when you have to take a decision, never you rely only on an algorithm that say black or white. You use the algorithm, but you are also a human being with a responsibility, so you have to interpret all the context of the decision. But, in fact, sometimes he's wrong. Sometimes he's wrong because, for instance, for the approval of medication, you know that indeed you do a randomized control trial, and you do a Neyman-Pearson test, and if P is below 5%, then you are very likely to have the approval. And if P is above 0.05, you will not have the approval because the test is negative. And why is it like that? Because the conflict of interest because of money are so important that if you begin to discuss the context, it will be very difficult to say, okay, we accept the medication. No, you need a very clear-cut rule, a written rule with yes or no, behavior. And in this situation, you really need a test from the theory of Neyman-Pearson. About teaching, even at that time, we are in 1960, he considered that there is a problem in teaching statistics. The teaching of statistics has fallen back into grave confusion 70 years ago, 50, 60 years ago. Teaching largely should be given by men or women who have had personal experience of research in the natural science. He said that Neyman shouldn't teach statistics because Neyman never did any natural science. So this is the answer of Neyman to the dispute with Fisher. So he say very quietly, our dispute may be symbolized by the opposing term of inductive reasoning and inductive behavior. And I really agree with that. I really agree with that. I came to the conclusion that at least in the sense of Fisher, the term inductive reasoning is empty except perhaps for a dogmatic use of certain measures of rational beliefs. And this is really the weakness of Neyman. He is wrong here. He is wrong. Induction indeed means something in philosophy. And in fact, most human beings use induction and not deduction. But in mathematics, indeed, we use deduction. And so Neyman was very involved in the deductive thought. The fight ended a little bit with this paper in 1993, a paper by Lehmann, who was a very famous theoretical statistician. And Lehmann, when he was young, was in the time where the dispute between Fisher and Neyman was very acute. And so he wrote a paper to conclude that the paper of Lehmann is too mathematical. And so at the end, he does not conclude on an epistemological point of view, he concludes on a mathematical point of view. And so the conclusion is a little bit unsatisfying. Unfortunately, the dispute stops there, and you have very, very few papers nowadays to continue the discussion. And so, what should be the discussion? On my point of view, we have first to consider, we are statisticians, we are dealing with data. This is our job. We are dealing with data. And we have to help people to say things about data. And in fact, you have two ways to say things about data. Two situations. The first one, which is by far the most frequent, is the refutation of hypotheses. You are looking for differences between male babies and female babies about cognitive process. This is your job. You are doing experiments, you have a hypothesis, you want to refute this hypothesis. There is no behavior, there is no decision to take at the end of your experiment. You just want to write a paper saying that you have seen 20 males, 20 females, and they are like that and like this, and maybe there is randomness, but you have the feeling that signals is above noise. And so you estimate a p-value. And there is a deductive inference. Sometimes statistics are used for decision assistance. For instance, to give the approval for a medication. Statistics help to take a decision, and these two situations are very different on an epistemological point of view. And here you need an inductive behavior. But be careful of the word. You have three words here, very important. What is an induction? And here Fisher mentioned explicitly what is an induction. First, remember, for Fisher, your sample comes from a hypothetical infinite population. And so an induction is to say, I have a sample, but this is just a sample. Now I have to say about real life, but I don't know what is real life, and I have no access to a real life. What I do on a mathematical point of view is that I postulate an infinite population from which my sample could have been taken randomly. This is a very sophisticated way to conceptualize real life. And if you do that, indeed, you can, because of the p-value, you can say something about what exists in the underlying infinite population. And he said, what do? I do from the particular to the general, from the sample to the hypothetical underlying population. This is an induction. What is an inference? An inference, it is when you ask the question, at the end, you are likely to say, this is true, this is not true. When you say this is true, this is not true, you are doing an inference. But because there is noise, you will never be able to say this is true, this is not true, because there is noise, and everything can happen with noise. So when you are dealing with noise, you can only estimate a level of possibility, and this is what does Fisher in a way. Behavior, this is during life. When you are a surgeon, you have to do this intervention or that intervention, and you have to choose, and this is a behavior. And when you have a behavior, you have risk, like in surgery. Of course, in fact, this is more complex. This is more complex because, indeed, even if you take a decision, you don't realize yourself only on algorithm. You take in consideration the concept, but from time to time, like with approval of medication, you need formal rules to take a decision. And so indeed, inductive behavior becomes something interesting. So, what are we doing in terms of statistics? If you are dealing with inductive inference, then you are just computing a p-value. And the smallest is the p-value, the less likely is the importance of the noise in your conclusion. And this is exactly what does everybody every day. If the p-value is 1.1000, 1 on 1000, people are very happy because the noise is likely to be very marginal in what we observe. And the p-value, if it is 4%, whoa. And if it is 7%, a tendency. And so some people say, you should never say highly significant, you should never say a tendency. Either you are below 5%, this is okay, or above 5%, this is a pity. No, of course not. Of course not. If you are in an inductive inference, of course, the level of the p-value is important in the conclusion, of course. If you consider a behavior, this is completely different. And you have to choose, if it is a behavior, you have to choose between several hypotheses, typically two. And these two hypotheses are unique. This is that or this intervention, that intervention. And if you have to choose, you take risk to be wrong. And these risks are asymmetrical. So you take risk. An important point is that it does not mean that if you accept a hypothesis, you consider that this hypothesis is true. You have seen in the paper of Neyman, he wrote that. He wrote that 80 years ago. We are going to discuss about the hypothesis we are going to accept, and we are not going to say that this hypothesis is true. And of course, you understand what I consider here. Most people that use statistical tests, when they find HA, they consider that in the paper that HA is true. This is true. No, of course not. If it is a behavior, you have risk. You have risk in accepting H1 and H0, and so H1 cannot be a composite hypothesis. And if you use a test like that, you have to estimate the type 2 error, because the type 2 error is a risk to accept a certain hypothesis. And if you do a behavior, you have to know both risks. And so, you know that there have been theoretical development after the Neyman and Pearson paper to extend this formulation of statistical tests. My impression is that these developments are interesting on a mathematical point of view, but it has been a disaster for teaching. Because of this development and of the notion of uniformly most powerful test, H1 disappeared. And you know that in many textbooks, H1 is theta different from theta 0. And so there is no more type 2 error. And so this is no more an inductive behavior. And so if it is not an inductive behavior, then just use the p-value. And in addition, if the alternate hypothesis is theta equal theta 1 is either positive or negative, and so the test is one-sided. And in fact, in statistics, in real life, you have only one-sided test. And in real life, this is evident. Very rarely, the two alternate hypotheses, the positive and the negative one, are symmetrical. If you test the efficacy of medication, the risk to say that it works while it does not work is completely different than the risk to say that it is worse while it is comparable. Completely different. And so this is absurd to say that you have 2.5 risk on the left and 2.5 risk on the right. So indeed, all tests are one-sided. Then there is no deductive statistical inference. There are only induction. What are deduction? Deduction exists only in mathematics and sometimes in real life. You know, I saw one day a girl that was 8 years old. She was swimming in the sea, and her father told her, "Do you consider that I can touch the sand where you are?" And she answered, "Oh, sure, I can do it, so you can do it." You know, I can touch the sun, but you are taller than me, so you can touch the sun. This is pure logic. This is a deduction. And we love that. We love deduction. This is fascinating for human beings. And so, and because many people consider that statistics is a subdomain of mathematics. And in mathematics, there are deductions. So in statistics, there are deductions too. And the most famous science, physics, is mathematized, fully mathematized. And so, apparently, in physics, you have deduction too, because you have number everywhere. And you have noticed that biologists, economists are jealous of physicists. Physicists is beautiful science. Biology, economy, not so beautiful. And so they are dreaming to have deduction too. Why? They have noise. If they have noise, they cannot make any deduction. Only induction, but that's life. They have to accept it. And so, how is it possible to prove something when there is noise? You have to accept to do induction. This is the only way to do something that looks like a proof. And this is exactly what did Fisher. Fisher considered a hypothetical underlying infinite population, and he proposed an inference on this population for an expected subject, you know. And so we say something in medicine, we say that randomized control trial proves things for an expected subject that does not exist in reality. So for a physician, this is a little bit tricky. You have evidence-based treatment. These treatments are proved to be efficient for an average subject that you will never face in your consultation. But anyway, it means something. It means something. No patients are like exactly the average patient, but many patients look like more or less to this average patient. And so you have to consider what say randomized control trial, but it does not say the truth. This is just what we can do with noise and statistical inference. So this is my last slide. First point, you have noticed that statistics are supposed to be neutral because they are numbers and mathematics, and obviously the way we present statistical inference comes from a very emotional situation. So statistics are not neutral. When we teach statistics, sometimes it is an easy solution to use only mathematics, you know. On an emotional point of view, mathematics are very easy to deal with. You present equation, and so they are right. So we just have to learn that, and bye-bye. No, the situation is much more complex because in statistics we have to deal with real life too. And so real life is not only pure mathematics. Unfortunately, we have a very important responsibility. You know, when we teach statistics to people, nowadays people are doing their own statistics with R, SPSS or SAS. And after, they will write interpretation in their papers. And with these papers, biologists, economists, politicians, physicians will do things in practice, and in a part, we are responsible of what they will interpret from their data. So this is not a small deal. And obviously, about concerning inference, there has been a Fisher-Neyman fight, and indeed, inference proposed by Fisher does not correspond to inference proposed by Neyman and Pearson. There are two different inferences, one inductive inference, the other inductive behavior. And these correspond to two very different situations, and I think we should say that to people exactly like what Fisher said in 1916. But first, perhaps we have to agree each other, and I will be very happy to exchange with you about that. Thank you for your attention.